He saw a transfer nurse. That was all. Just another body filling a gap in the St. Michael's trauma unit rotation, someone to pour coffee alone in the break room while the real nurses bonded over 18-hour shifts and patient saves that made the local news. Dr. Pierce didn't see the surgical scars on her hands, thin white lines that caught the fluorescent light like lightning frozen in skin. He didn't see the faded unit patch sewn inside her tactical jacket lining, tucked away in her locker, the same insignia worn by Tier 1 operators hunting through the Helmand Province mountains. He saw only what she wanted him to see: Brooke Sullivan, RN, 9 months into her assignment at Atlanta's premier trauma center, steady hands, and a quiet voice that never challenged, never questioned, never stepped outside her lane. What he didn't know was that every shift she worked, every patient she stabilized, every moment she spent in the sterile corridors of St. Michael's was part of a mission that had nothing to do with saving lives and everything to do with the trafficking ring moving contaminated surgical supplies through the hospital's procurement system. The mission that had brought her back to civilian life. The mission that had taken her son away. St. Michael's trauma unit hummed under fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning, antiseptic cutting through the night air like a blade, the rhythm of ventilators and monitor beeps creating a mechanical symphony that most nurses learn to ignore. Brooke moved through the graveyard shift with economy of motion, nothing wasted, nothing excessive. She could place a 20-gauge angiocath in the dark. She'd done it in worse light, in sandstorms, with explosions rattling the forward operating base walls. Her assessment times ran half the unit average. Senior nurses watched her work and said nothing, sensing something in her movements that belonged to a different kind of training. When she reached for the crash cart supplies, her knuckles tightened visibly as old scar tissue pulled across the back of her hands. 17 shrapnel wounds reconstructed in a field tent. 17 lives that had depended on her staying steady when the tent shook. But that was before. Before she'd left the Navy. Before she'd tried to live a normal life and found it couldn't contain her. Before her son had told her he was enlisting, and she'd realized that leaving the service didn't mean leaving the fight. The break room at St. Michael's was a 30 by 20 space with a refrigerator that hummed like it was dying, a coffee maker that had seen better decades, and walls decorated with staff photos from various department outings. Nobody looked happy in any of them. Brooke sat at the corner table at midnight, the way she sat every shift, her meal precise and practiced, a protein bar, black coffee, no sugar. The other nurses filtered in gradually, their voices bright and easy in that way that hospital staff developed, laughter carved out of exhaustion and dark humor. The moment they noticed her, the laughter stopped. Not completely. Brooke never received the courtesy of a dramatic silence. Instead, conversation simply pivoted. Topics shifted. The clustering of bodies at the coffee station tightened, creating a magnetic field that didn't include her corner table. She watched them the way a wolf watches prey. It has no interest in hunting, clinical observation without judgment. She'd worked in combat hospitals in the Peck Valley, had stood in operating tents while wounded operators bled out on tables, and those environments had contained more genuine humanity than this sterile break room. But this was the assignment. This was the mission. Dr. Pierce arrived for his shift rotation at 11:11 p.m., exactly 13 minutes before the official changeover, moving through the hospital corridors with the precise timing of someone who understood that arriving early conveyed authority without actually proving anything. He was 42 years old, had trained at Johns Hopkins and Stanford, and carried the kind of confidence that came from inheriting money and never having it questioned. His father had been a prominent cardiologist. His uncle sat on the hospital board. He'd gotten his position through connections that had nothing to do with merit and everything to do with family networks that kept elite positions cycling within elite families. He scanned the trauma board, pulling up patient files on his iPad, his eyes landing on the assignment schedule. That was when he saw the name, Brooke Sullivan, RN, assigned to the North Corridor. He'd noticed her before, of course. Hard not to notice someone who moved with such precise efficiency, whose hands never trembled, whose voice carried a flatness that suggested she was somewhere else entirely, even when she was standing right in front of you. He'd made a mental note of her during her first month. Transfer nurse from out of state. No local connections. No family in Atlanta. No one to protect her. She'd made one critical mistake during that first rotation. She'd corrected something he'd said in front of the Hendersons, a family with political connections, guests in the trauma unit while their grandson recovered from a motorcycle accident. Just a small thing. He'd said the post-op wound sites should be checked every 4 hours. She'd quietly noted that the protocol called for every 2 hours during the first 72 hours, and the family had noticed. The Hendersons had mentioned it at the country club. His colleagues had started asking questions. And that was when Dr. Pierce had decided that Brooke Sullivan needed to understand her place in the hospital hierarchy. The Naval Intelligence briefing had been short and precise, delivered by a woman with Lieutenant Commander's insignia and eyes that had seen classified files Brooke would never touch again. They met in an Atlanta safe house, a nondescript apartment in Midtown with blackout curtains and a secure phone line running through the kitchen wall. The briefing file contained 3 pages of redacted intelligence, marked top secret no-phone, detailing a procurement network moving defective surgical supplies through major hospitals on the East Coast. The contamination, titanium dust, microscopic particles that shouldn't exist in sterile equipment, was causing post-operative infections at a rate that should have triggered federal investigation 6 months ago. St. Michael's was the distribution hub. Someone inside the hospital was running the operation. Intelligence suggested the involvement was high enough in the procurement chain that hospital security couldn't be trusted. What they needed was someone to move through the trauma unit for 9 months, document patterns, identify the contact points in the supply chain, and stay invisible while doing it. What they needed was someone who understood both the military and the civilian medical world. What they needed was someone with nothing to lose. The briefing officer had used Brooke's classified name during the meeting, and even that sounded like it belonged to someone else, Valkyrie. Captain Brooke Sullivan's call sign during her 14 years in Naval Special Warfare Medical. The woman she'd been when her son had been born, when she'd made the decision to leave active duty and try to be a mother instead of a warrior. The woman she'd become again the moment her son turned 18 and enlisted in the Navy SEAL program. Her son was in Helmand Province with the 2nd Platoon of SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, serving under the command of Lieutenant Commander Nash, a veteran operator with 2 combat deployments and a reputation for bringing his people home alive. The intelligence officer had included a photograph, classified, showing Nash with her son during their pre-deployment workup at Naval Base San Diego. They were both carrying $416 Hong Kong rifles with EOTech holograms, both wearing the same focused expression that Brooke recognized from her own mirror. Her son had inherited his father's height, his grandmother's dark eyes, and Brooke's capacity for remaining calm while everything around him burned. She'd tried to give him normal. She'd tried to give him school dances and college acceptance letters and a future that didn't involve helicopters and night vision and the particular kind of trauma that never fully healed. But his genetics had other plans. His DNA had made him a warrior, and the Navy SEAL program had simply given him the tools to become what he was always going to be. The intelligence briefing officer had placed her son's file on the table, right next to the procurement investigation folder, and said, Lieutenant Commander Nash unit has been receiving defective surgical supplies through their forward supply line. The titanium contamination is showing up in post-operative infection rates among his operators. We've had 2 amputations in his platoon because of infected wounds caused by contaminated surgical equipment. One of those amputations might have been preventable. The briefing officer had left the files open on the table. She'd left the safe house, and Brooke had stood alone in that nondescript apartment with 2 folders, one containing her mission, one containing her son's unit roster. She'd understood in that moment what the Navy had known all along, that a mother protecting her child was the most dangerous weapon in the world. The break room went quiet when Dr. Pierce walked in, not because anyone had announced his presence, but because his presence announced itself. He carried his white coat draped over one arm, his stethoscope looped around his neck like he was conducting an orchestra that existed only for him. He surveyed the room with the expression of someone inspecting facilities, his eyes passing over the other nurses without registering them, then stopping on Brooke. He held the pause long enough that everyone in the room felt it. He walked past the coffee maker, past the refrigerator, and stopped directly beside her table. "You're the transfer," he said. "Not a question." His voice came out smooth and controlled, the tone someone used when addressing subordinates at a faculty meeting. Brooke looked up from her coffee, her expression neutral in the way that had served her through 14 years of military service. She'd seen officers like Pierce before, men who'd been given authority and mistaken it for power. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "Brooke Sullivan." He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Brooke Sullivan, I want you to understand something about the way we do things at St. Michael's. We have protocols. We have hierarchies. And we have respect for the people who've actually built this place." He glanced around the break room, making sure the other nurses were paying attention. Transfer nurses sometimes come in thinking they know how we should operate. They come in with ideas and opinions and a sense that they can improve systems that have been working for years. He turned back to her, and his smile widened. "That gets people hurt. Do you understand?" The room was absolutely silent. Brooke had heard worse threats in combat zones. She'd heard mortar fire and had to keep working. She'd heard screaming that would have broken most people and had simply moved to the next patient. But what she felt in that moment was something different. It was recognition. It was the understanding that Dr. Pierce had just drawn a line, and that everything that happened next would be him testing whether she was willing to cross it. She set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, the ceramic making a soft sound against the table. "I understand, sir," she said. Her voice was exactly the same as before, flat and measured, the voice of someone who was somewhere else entirely. He waited, as if expecting her to say more, to defend herself, to give him something to push against. When she offered nothing, he nodded once and left the break room without another word. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 30 seconds later, when the other nurses began their slow retreat from the room, avoiding her eyes, their shoulders angled away, their conversation resuming in lowered voices that carefully excluded her. The tactical jacket hung in her locker in the staff lockers, the unit patch sewn inside the lining still hidden, still secret, still the only thing that was entirely and completely hers. She sat in that break room corner, drinking her coffee, and understood that Dr. Pierce had just made his first move. Not toward her. Toward the mission. He'd just signaled to everyone in the unit that Brooke Sullivan was outside the circle, was someone to be careful around, was someone to distance themselves from. By the time he was finished, no one would speak to her at all. By the time he was finished, she would be completely isolated. She had no idea that isolation was exactly where she needed to be. The morning rounds began like every other morning, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical dirge, the smell of antiseptic cutting through the stale air of the recovery wing. Senator Harmon's daughter lay in bed for post-op appendectomy, her vitals stable on the monitors. Dr. Pierce entered with the attending physician trailing behind him, charts in hand, and Brooke positioned herself at the foot of the bed with the medication tray prepared according to protocol. Pierce reviewed the daughter's chart, nodding with the casual authority of a man who'd never been questioned in his life. "Post-op pain management," he announced, writing the order. "Morphine, 50 milligrams for every 4 hours." Brooke's eyes caught the decimal. Her hands had threaded through field dressing kits in Helmand Province, had calculated morphine doses under fire when every decimal point meant the difference between sedation and respiratory failure. She looked at the chart, then at Pierce, her voice steady and measured. "Doctor, that's a factor of 10 above standard post-op dosing for her weight class. Standard would be 5 milligrams. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze. Pierce's face reddened like a sunset bleeding across concrete. His jaw clenched, muscles working beneath the skin. "Nurse Sullivan," he said, voice dropping to something dangerous, "when I want input from someone who couldn't finish medical school, I'll ask." Senator Harmon watched from the visitor's chair. His daughter's eyes widened. Pierce crossed out the order with hard, aggressive strokes. Rewrote it at the correct dosage. Then added a note in the chart, "Not medical, administrative. Check with pharmacy before questioning physicians again." Brooke didn't flinch. Didn't blink. She simply nodded and moved to adjust the fall line, her hand steady as surgical steel. But that wasn't the worst part. By that afternoon, a fabricated written warning appeared on the unit board, positioned where every staff member passed during shift change. The document was printed on official hospital letterhead, her name centered at the top in bold. Pierce hadn't even signed it with his own name, just a typed signature block. Cowardice dressed as bureaucracy. That evening, he conducted his masterpiece in the break room during his lunch hour. The door was open. His voice was loud. And every nurse on shift made their way through at some point to hear him speak. 9 months, Pierce said to whoever would listen, and she thinks she runs this unit. Atlanta General probably let her go for the same attitude. These transfer nurses, they come in thinking protocols don't apply to them. Thinking they know better. He shook his head, performance perfect. I've been in this hospital 15 years. She doesn't even know where the supply closet is. Word moved through the trauma unit like toxin through a bloodstream. By Wednesday night, when Brooke entered the break room at 2 a.m. to pour coffee during her rounds, 3 nurses mid-conversation stood and left without finishing their cups. They didn't speak to her. Didn't acknowledge her. Just gathered their things and walked out, their silence louder than any words. She watched them go with a cold, flat stare. Then poured her coffee and drank it alone at a table meant for 6. Thursday morning during trauma handoff, a routine GSW patient coming through, Pierce staged his performance like a theatrical director blocking a scene. By week's end, Brooke was completely isolated. She ate alone at the corner table in the cafeteria while clusters of nurses gathered at other tables, their backs subtly angled away. During shift change, the night staff would clear the break room whenever she entered, their conversation stopping mid-sentence. One nurse even stood up from her chair, leaving behind a full cup of tea, just to avoid sharing the space. She endured it all with controlled anger. The kind of anger that doesn't shake or tremble but instead calcifies into something sharp and precise. When Pierce passed her in the hallway and made some cutting remark about her nursing school background, she simply nodded and continued her work. When another physician, one of Pierce's allies, made a point of reviewing her vital sign assessments during morning rounds, questioning every entry, she responded with facts. Just facts. No defensiveness. No tears. No retreat to a supply closet to fall apart. That was the mistake they all made. They thought her composure meant weakness. They thought her silence meant she was broken. What they didn't know was that silence was a weapon she'd spent 12 years perfecting. And that controlled anger wasn't resignation, it was restraint. The kind that only comes from having already survived the worst the world has to offer and deciding that civilian politics weren't going to be what finally took her down. The isolation deepened. The cold shoulders multiplied. The whispered conversations that stopped when she approached became part of the fabric of her shift. But Brooke Sullivan had been trained to operate alone. She'd held dying soldiers' hands in the darkness of forward operating bases. She'd made impossible decisions under fire. She'd carried people across her shoulders when their legs wouldn't carry them anymore. A few nurses avoiding eye contact in Atlanta didn't even register on the scale of things that could break her. What happened next would prove that mercy was a luxury she could no longer afford. Thursday night at 11:11 p.m., the trauma bay doors exploded open. Paramedics rushed through in controlled chaos, their boots hammering tile in perfect synchronization, 1, 2, 3, 4. The gurney beneath them carried a man in tactical gear soaked dark with blood, his face slack and unconscious. The lead paramedic was shouting vitals before they'd even crossed the threshold, gunshot wound, left abdomen, entry at the anterior superior iliac crest, massive hemorrhage, we got 2 units running wide open, pressure's been dropping the last 3 minutes, ETA surgery 15 minutes ago. Brooke caught the patient's face as they wheeled past the supply station. Everything stopped. She knew that face. Had studied it in photographs during her naval intelligence briefing 9 months ago. Lieutenant Commander Nash. 28 years old. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. The man who led her son's fire team in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. The man whose tactical decisions had kept her son alive through 2 deployments in one of the deadliest valleys in theater. The man who had sent her a handwritten letter 3 years ago when her boy came home, "Your son is the finest soldier I've ever commanded, and he saved my life twice in 3 days." She set down her coffee. Black, no sugar, cooling in a ceramic cup marked with a faint lipstick stain. The cup made a soft sound against the laminate counter. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their endless mechanical hum. She moved. Didn't rush. That would draw attention. Just walked with the measured stride of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once, following the trauma team toward the surgical wing. The night staff was already mobilizing around her, ICU nurses detaching monitors, circulating nurses prepping the OR, anesthesia checking intubation equipment. Pierce was nowhere near the action, which meant he was already on the phone in the physician's lounge, calling for authorization, following protocols, doing everything by the book while a man bled out on the gurney. Nash was conscious now. Barely. His eyes were the color of slate in winter, and they found hers as they wheeled him past the glass partition separating the main trauma bay from the observation hallway. For 1/2 second, there was recognition. He'd seen her photograph too, part of the briefing package about his new trauma nurse. His mouth moved. No sound came out. They got him into OR3. Emergency exploratory laparotomy to identify the bleed, stop the hemorrhage, repair what could be repaired. Brooke assisted from the observation gallery behind reinforced glass, watching Pierce's hands shake slightly as he made the incision. Good hands, technically. But something was wrong. The way he was moving. The way his jaw kept clenching and releasing. Fear. She could taste it on the air, metallic like iron filings. The surgery lasted for hours and 12 minutes. They found the bleeding, packed the abdomen, stabilized him, got him to ICU with 2 units of fresh frozen plasma running and a promise to monitor for secondary complications. By 3:15 a.m., Nash was intubated, sedated, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. His left shoulder had a tattoo visible above his gown, a faded unit patch. Same unit patch she had sewn into the lining of her jacket when she'd left active duty. She sat in the break room at 4:33 a.m., alone, watching the fluorescent lights cast their sickly glow across the empty chairs. Nobody came in. That had been the case for a week now. The break room cleared whenever she entered. Nurses turning their backs as she poured coffee. Orderlies finding reasons to be elsewhere. Even Dr. Pierce's allies had learned to avoid proximity, as if her ostracism was contagious. She pulled out her phone. Naval intelligence contact. One encrypted message, asset compromised. Recommend immediate extraction. She didn't send it yet. Just held the phone in her lap and stared at the dark screen. The mission was weeks from completion. She had documented 17 separate shipments of contaminated surgical supplies, traced them through the supply chain, identified the procurement officer involved. 2 SEALs had died from surgical infections caused by substandard equipment in theater, 1 in Helmand Province, 1 in Kandahar. Dirty needles. Contaminated sutures. Grade C sterilization protocols. The trafficking network operated out of a distribution warehouse in Cobb County, and she was close enough to taste the prosecution. But Nash was upstairs in ICU with a heavily bandaged abdomen and a 50-50 prognosis if the infection protocols held. She put the phone away. Closed her eyes. Listened to the hum. At 6:41 a.m., Brooke was checking Nash's post-op vitals, blood pressure holding, oxygen saturation steady at 98%, heart rhythm normal, sinus, core temperature coming up as the warming blanket did its work. His monitor showed the steady blip 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 of a man holding on. She adjusted the morphine drip by 0.5 milliliters, noted the time, and was preparing to leave when his monitor alarm shrieked. Flat line. Her hands moved before her brain caught up. She'd seen this before. In the field. In the forward operating base in Helmand Province when a Marine came in with a sucking chest wound and exactly 90 seconds to live. The pericardium fills with blood instead of letting the heart expand. The heart stops. The man dies. She was already moving toward the crash cart. Dr. Pierce was on the unit somewhere. She could see him at the far end of the hallway, pen in hand, reviewing charts. He looked up at the alarm, processing. His mouth opened. He was reaching for the phone, reaching for authorization, reaching for the next protocol in the hierarchy. The second-year resident was frozen. The attending was 2 floors down. The charge nurse was calling overhead, "Code Blue, ICU Bed 7, code team responding." 90 seconds. That's how long before brain death becomes irreversible. For minutes to prep an OR. 6 minutes to transport if the elevator cooperated. 10 total. Nash would be dead inside 90 seconds. She grabbed the thoracotomy kit from the crash cart. Scalpel with the blade already exposed, ribs spreader gleaming under the hallway lights, the gleaming metal instruments that had a voice of their own. Her hands knew what to do. Had learned what to do in Helmand Province, performing this exact procedure under mortar fire on a forward operating base where the nearest surgical facility was 20 minutes by helicopter. Pierce was running now. "Sullivan, step back, that's an order." His voice was shaking. Uncertain. The voice of a man who'd never had to make a split-second decision that meant the difference between life and death. She ignored him. Peeled Nash's gown away. Didn't bother with prep. No time. The iodine would come later if he lived. Right now there was only the incision. She made it at the 5th intercostal space, angled blade moving with the precision of muscle memory, the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. The night staff pressed against the glass partition, utterly silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A nurse with 18 years in emergency medicine stood perfectly still, her hand over her mouth. A surgical tech who'd seen thousands of procedures stood with his hands at his sides, watching. Brooke cracked the ribs with the spreader. The sound was like breaking a wishbone, soft and final. She opened the chest cavity, her fingers finding the pericardial sac distended with blood, the fluid pressing down on the heart, suffocating it. A simple relief. One small incision through the membrane. The blood spilled out like a confession. Nash's monitor flickered once. Twice. The rhythm returned, wavering, then strong, then steady, then perfect. Sinus rhythm. 84 beats per minute. She stepped back. Blood covered her hands to the elbows. Her gloves were saturated. Nash's color was returning from the gray-white of near death to something closer to human. A resident materialized at her elbow, stunned. "Jesus Christ, how did you?" She didn't look up. Didn't respond. Just watched Nash monitor until the rhythm held solid, then turned and met Dr. Pierce's eyes across the hallway. His face was the color of spoiled milk. His phone was already in his hand. She could see the calculation happening in his eyes. The threat assessment. A nurse performing an emergency thoracotomy in the hallway without authorization. Without attending approval. Without paperwork. Breaking every protocol, every chain of command, every institutional rule. Her license was already in jeopardy from his fabricated warning. This would end her career. Completely. Utterly. Permanently. But Nash was alive. His heart was beating. His oxygen saturation was climbing. And in 3 hours, when the Pentagon called to ask about their missing SEAL team asset, they would ask Pierce to explain why he'd frozen while a transfer nurse saved the man's life. Pierce's jaw clenched. He turned and walked toward the physician's lounge. His hands were shaking. By 7:15 a.m., 3 board members had received phone calls. By 7:36 a.m., an anonymous complaint had been filed with the Georgia Nursing Board. By 8:56 a.m., Brooke's badge had been confiscated. Her access revoked. Her parking pass invalidated. A suspension letter was printed and placed in an envelope on her locker, pending review, pending investigation, pending the determination of whether she'd endangered her patient or saved his life. The irony was precise and sharp as a scalpel blade. The board investigators would find what they were looking for. But it wouldn't be Brooke's violation. It would be Pierce's. Her fingers found it. The pericardial tear, tissue separated like lips in a scream, blood pooling in the sac surrounding Nash's heart. She didn't hesitate. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. His oxygen saturation climbed. 75. 82. 88. The monitor's beeping steadied from chaos into rhythm. Sinus rhythm. She could hear Pierce behind her, his voice cracking like porcelain under pressure. "You can't just, protocol demands, lawsuit, Sullivan, I'm calling administration right now." She didn't turn around. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of 22 hours under fire at forward operating based wire, muscle memory that didn't care about protocols or the screaming of a man whose power was evaporating in real time. Nash's chest rose and fell. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Around them, through the glass walls of the ICU hallway, every nurse and resident and respiratory tech had stopped moving. The entire night shift stood frozen, watching a transfer nurse save a man Dr. Pierce had already given up on. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Pierce shoved past her, his face mottled red, his voice climbing into registers that should have shattered glass. "You performed surgery without authorization, without surgical gloves, in a goddamn hallway." His hands trembled as he reached for Nash's chart. Not with concern. With calculation. With the look of a man watching his leverage evaporate. Brooke stripped off her gloves. The latex snapped like gunshots in the sudden quiet. She'd saved the patient. She'd also just revealed herself. A combat nurse with field thoracotomy skills didn't learn those in a civilian trauma rotation. A transfer nurse didn't move like that under pressure, didn't know where to place a needle in a pericardium without ultrasound, didn't know the exact angle to achieve decompression without collapsing a lung. She'd blown 9 months of cover in 90 seconds to keep Nash alive. She could live with that math. What she couldn't live with was the phone call that came 47 minutes later. Pierce had his allies on speed dial. The hospital board chair, a man named Westbrook whose son had been a resident in Pierce's program years ago. The chief medical officer, an administrator who'd learned early that opposing Pierce cost more politically than supporting him. And someone in the state medical board, Brooke never found out who, didn't need to, someone with access to complaint forms and the willingness to stamp them anonymous. By 6 in the morning, before the hospital's administrative offices even opened, 3 board members had received calls. By 7, an anonymous complaint had been filed alleging that Brooke Sullivan had performed an authorized surgical intervention in direct violation of her scope of practice as a registered nurse, endangering patient safety and demonstrating dangerous autonomy and disregard for medical hierarchy. By 8, her badge had been confiscated. By 9, her access to the hospital's computer systems had been revoked. By 10, she'd been suspended pending formal review. The investigation, Pierce had explained to the board chair on a call she found out about later, would take weeks. The state nursing board moved slowly. Years, sometimes. By then, the narrative would be set. Rogue nurse. Insubordination. Boundary violation. No one would remember the patient who'd coded. They'd remember the protocol breach. Nash lay in the ICU with a breathing tube still down his throat, his eyes closed, his vital signs stable because of the hands that had just been stripped of her hospital ID. Brooke had watched them take her badge from her scrub pocket. She hadn't flinched. She hadn't spoken. She'd simply nodded and walked toward the employee exit, past the nurses' station where the same staff members who'd turned their backs in the break room last week were now staring at her with something worse than hostility. Pity. They thought she was finished. She was. But not the way they thought. The intelligence handler's call came at 2 in the afternoon. Extraction vehicle in 40 minutes at the Publix parking lot on Peachtree. Pack 1 bag. Leave everything else. The trafficking network had gone dark within hours of her emergency procedure, phones dropped, dead drops abandoned, their supply logistics contact in the surgical distribution center had fled Atlanta for a brother-in-law's place in Baton Rouge. Brooke had spent 9 months building a network of informants, 9 months documenting the diversion of sterile equipment to black market channels, 9 months running surveillance on equipment that should have been going to military bases and instead was being resold to unlicensed field clinics and insurgent networks. All of it was scattered. All of it was gone. The mission had died the moment Nash coded. She'd chosen him. At 3 in the morning, Brooke sat alone in a Waffle House on Memorial Drive, fluorescent lights humming overhead like machinery counting down toward something. She wore her bloody scrubs still, the tactical jacket pulled tight over them, the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining pressing against her ribs. The fabric was worn, the insignia barely visible anymore, a trident and anchor, the same symbol Nash wore on his uniform. She'd carried it through 9 months of being called incompetent and reckless and insubordinate. 9 months of silence and restraint. 9 months of a mask so practiced it had nearly become her real face. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with the eyes of someone who'd seen worse than bloody scrubs, had refilled it once without asking and then left her alone. The trucker in the booth 3 down was studying his menu like it contained secrets. Outside the window, rain hammered the parking lot in sheets, the asphalt reflecting the neon Waffle House sign in shades of yellow and red that looked like wounds. She stared at her reflection in the dark glass. Hollow-eyed. Hair matted with dried blood that wasn't hers. The woman looking back seemed like someone pretending to be human. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from her handler. She let it ring. Let it go to voicemail. Her son's face superimposed itself over her reflection, the day she'd told him she was leaving the Navy Medical Corps. "I can help more people on the civilian side," she'd said, and he'd tried to hide the disappointment, the sense that his mother had abandoned the fight. He'd been 12. He was 17 now. In 6 months he'd be in college. He'd probably never know why she really left, what assignment she'd taken on, what she'd failed to accomplish. Nash had a wife somewhere. Children, maybe. The intelligence files didn't include that kind of detail. They included combat effectiveness ratings and medical specializations and the names of 17 SEALs on his team who'd been exposed to contaminated equipment sourced through the network Brooke had been tracking. 17 men. Brooke had gotten her hands on fragments of the supply chain, enough to identify 3 distribution points, enough to build a case that would have taken down at least 2 suppliers. Enough to matter. Now those suppliers were liquidating inventory, burning records, moving to dark web distribution channels that would take months or years to penetrate again. And Nash was alive. And Brooke's career in healthcare was finished. And her 9-month cover as a vulnerable transfer nurse, as someone who could be bullied and isolated and pressured into making mistakes, was ash. The trade-off made mathematical sense. One life against an operational objective. Combat medicine taught you to calculate in those terms. Greatest good for the greatest number. Sometimes the equation was simple. But her son didn't know this. He thought his mother had quit the fight. The jacket felt heavier than it should. The unit patch beneath the lining felt like an anchor, pulling her down into the vinyl booth, down into the fluorescent light and the cold coffee and the rain outside that sounded like static on a dead channel. She pulled the jacket tighter and waited for the extraction van that would take her to a safe house in North Carolina where she'd debrief and get assignments for whatever came next. Her phone buzzed. Her handler. She silenced it. In the ICU at St. Michael's, Nash slept with machines breathing for him. In his sleep his hand, the one not wrapped in bandages, was relaxed. He would wake. He would remember the woman in the tactical jacket, the woman who'd had the presence of mind to cut into him and save his life instead of waiting for protocols to move at hospital speed. He would remember calling her name, the call sign that only his team knew. And in 48 hours, maybe 72, the people who ran the Navy SEAL teams would find out that one of their captains had been operating undercover in an Atlanta hospital for 9 months. That she'd blown her assignment to keep one of their commanders alive. The waitress approached with a coffee pot. Brooke shook her head once, barely a gesture. The waitress set down the check anyway, a small kindness, a tiny gesture that said someone in the world still saw her as human. Brooke left cash on the table, 40% tip, and pushed her way out into the rain. The parking lot was empty except for a van with its lights off, waiting in the far corner near the storm drain where water ran in rivers. She walked toward it, her combat boots leaving prints in the wet asphalt, each step taking her further from the woman she'd pretended to be, carrying her deeper into what came next. Behind her, the Waffle House lights blurred in the rain. Ahead, the darkness where the extraction team was waiting. The mission was burned. The network was scattered. Nash was alive. It would have to be enough. 3 hours after Brooke's suspension, the ICU fell silent. Not the silence of a resting patient, but the silence of a room holding its breath. Nash's eyes opened at 6:13 a.m. to a wall of uniforms pressing against the glass: night shift nurses, day shift nurses, respiratory therapists, the janitor who'd mopped trauma bays for 18 years. They'd all heard the news by then. They'd all seen the federal vehicles pulling into the parking garage. The door opened. Admiral James Holloway stepped through first, his dress blues immaculate despite the 5 a.m. flight from the Pentagon. Behind him came a 2-star general, a lieutenant commander in dress whites, and 3 investigators in dark suits carrying sealed folders. The nurses pressed back instinctively. Admirals don't walk into civilian trauma units. Generals don't stand in ICU corridors. This was authority that transcended hospital hierarchy, that made protocols meaningless. Nash tried to sit up. Tubes pulled. Monitors spiked. His voice was gravel, his lungs still learning how to work without the ventilator. "Sir." Just that. The discipline of 23 years of service, even half-drugged on post-op sedation. The Admiral approached the bed, his presence making the air pressure change like a storm front moving in. "Lieutenant Commander Nash. Good to see you breathing, son." Nash's eyes moved past him to the glass. To the faces beyond. To the one face that mattered. Brooke stood at the back of the corridor, still in yesterday's scrubs, her suspension badge clipped to her collar with the photograph scratched out. The Admiral followed Nash's gaze. "Who performed the save?" Holloway asked quietly. Nash's eyes locked on Brooke. His chest rose. One word came out like a prayer, like recognition, like the final piece of a mission puzzle clicking into place. "Valkyrie." The corridor went absolutely still. Even the monitors seemed to hold their beeping. Brooke's expression didn't change. She stood with her shoulders level, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing steady as a metronome. The composure of someone who'd learned long ago that the moment you show the world your fear, you've already lost. The Admiral turned to face the corridor, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "I'm reading a citation. Captain Brooke Sullivan, Navy Medical Corps. Silver Star recipient for combat trauma surgery, Helmand Province. Combat casualty evacuation, 2019. Surgical intervention under fire, 3 confirmed saves with 0 mortality in casualty chain." He paused. The silence stretched. Combat knife thoracotomy procedure. Pericardia tamponade relief. Performed in a forward operating base with no sterile field, no imaging, no backup. That same Captain Sullivan performed an identical procedure in this hospital last night. Same patient. Same technique. Same outcome. Dr. Pierce shoved through the gathered crowd, his face the color of old concrete. "This is impossible. She's a nurse. A transfer. She doesn't have surgical credentials, she doesn't have." A 2-star general stepped forward. 6'3", shoulders like a cargo plane. His eyes were colorless and absolutely still. He looked at Brooke's chest, where someone had already pinned the tactical jacket she'd worn under her scrubs for 9 months. At the row of ribbons visible through the open collar. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Purple Heart with cluster. Navy Commendation Medal. Campaign ribbons from 3 theaters. He raised his right hand and saluted. The Admiral saluted. The Lieutenant Commander saluted. Every nurse in that corridor, including the ones who'd turned their backs to her yesterday, raised their hands and saluted a woman they'd worked with for 9 months without seeing her. Pierce stumbled backward. "No. She violated protocols. She performed an authorized surgery. You violated nothing, Captain," the Admiral said without looking at Pierce. You operated under a lawful military order placed on you 9 months ago. Your assignment is now concluded. Welcome home. The moment Pierce understood, his face underwent a transformation. Not shock anymore. Something worse. Comprehension. The realization that every call he'd made, every ally he'd activated, every investigation he'd triggered, had been aimed at a woman the Pentagon had been protecting since her arrival. The State Board investigators, the ones Pierce had called in his rage, had pulled St. Michael's surgical supply records. They'd been thorough. Meticulous. They'd noticed shipments that didn't reconcile with invoices, lot numbers that disappeared from the chain of custody logs, a pattern of diversion that spiraled backward through 18 months of procurement approvals. All of them signed by Dr. Kenneth Pierce. The same trafficking network Brooke had been documenting. The same contaminated supplies that had led to 2 SEAL Team 3 casualties in Helmand Province 6 months prior. Pierce had been selling sterile equipment and replacing it with expired stock, pocketing $60,000 a month from a supplier network that moved equipment through hospitals all along the eastern seaboard. Federal agents arrived at St. Michael's at 10:04 a.m. with seizure warrants and a 287-page indictment. They arrested Dr. Pierce in the surgeon's lounge while he was pouring coffee. He was already in plea negotiations, a deal offered to him by his own attorney at 9:15 a.m. when the FBI made it clear they had 18 months of digital forensics, a cooperative witness from the supply company, and documentation linking him to 2 Marine deaths from contaminated equipment. Permanent medical license revocation. 2 years federal custody suspended to probation. 2 years assigned to drive medical supply vans for veterans clinics across Georgia, watching every box of equipment he touched, every delivery he made, a walking monument to the consequences of choosing money over the lives in your care. The head nurse, Margaret Chen, the woman who'd refilled Brooke's coffee in silence every shift for 9 months, walked to the unit board where Pierce's fabricated written warning still hung, now yellowed and brittle as a dead leaf. She pulled it down with shaking hands and shredded it in front of the gathered staff. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were processing the moment, converting shame into something that might eventually become apology. 3 nurses who'd cleared the break room when Brooke entered now stood frozen in the corridor, unable to meet her eyes. One of them, Derek, had said Brooke's name like it tasted like acid for 2 months. He stared at the floor now, his mouth open slightly, his world rearranging itself in real time. The Admiral dismissed the gathered crowd with a nod, and they moved with the fluid precision of people caught between 2 systems of authority. Hospital protocol and military command rarely intersected. When they did, military won. It always did. By noon, Brooke stood at Nash's bedside. The ICU had been cleared of observers except for the Admiral, who waited outside the door reading casualty reports with the focus of a man who would never forget a name. Nash was more awake now, his eyes tracking with purpose, the fog of post-op anesthesia lifting like morning mist. His hand moved across the bed railing. Found hers. Squeezed with surprising strength for a man who'd coded 48 hours prior. "Your son's alive," Nash said. His voice was still gravel, but steady. "Because of what you gathered here. 9 months. 12 arrests. The equipment that would have shipped to his unit next month was in Pierce's warehouse. Contaminated. Expired. Your intel stopped it." Brooke's jaw tightened. Not from emotion, composure held firm, but from something releasing inside her chest, something she'd been carrying for 9 months, something that had weight and shape and finally found ground to rest on. "The network?" she asked. "Pentagon moved on it an hour ago. 12 arrests across 3 states. 6 supply companies. For hospital procurement officers. Your son's team gets clean equipment. They go back to Helmand Province knowing they won't die from the supplies meant to keep them alive." She nodded once. Processed. Filed away. The part of her that was still Captain Sullivan, still a warrior, took the intelligence and stored it where it belonged. The part of her that was Nash's commanding officer's colleague, the part connected to her own son's survival, breathed for the first time in 9 months. Through the ICU window, the morning shift nurses pressed against the glass like they were trying to see something they'd missed. The same faces that had turned away from her. The same team that had cleared the break room, that had refilled her coffee in cold silence, that had let Dr. Pierce's poison seep into their judgment until they saw only what he'd told them to see. Now they saw her whole. The nurse who'd held the door open yesterday when Brooke arrived for her suspension stepped into the ICU, her name tag reading Sandra, her eyes red-rimmed. She approached slowly, like approaching something sacred or dangerous or both. "I should have." Sandra started. "You didn't know what you were looking at," Brooke said quietly. "Not forgiveness yet. But the beginning of it. The acknowledgement that people are shaped by what they believe, and belief is fragile and infectious and doesn't require truth to spread." The Admiral entered with discharge papers and new orders. Not reassignment. Not extraction back into shadow work. Something else. "St. Michael's has requested you as permanent trauma unit director," he said. "The position comes with full authorization to restructure the department. Hospital board approved it at 10:30 this morning. They saw the news. They made the offer before I could suggest it." Brooke looked at the nurses through the glass. At the trauma bay where she'd worked in silence. At the hallway where she'd performed field medicine without hesitation and been suspended for it. At the break room where she'd poured coffee with steady hands while everyone watched, judging a book by its cover without knowing the cover was fiction. Her phone vibrated. A text from her son, a photograph of his team in full gear, weapons loaded, ready to deploy. Nash's replacement commander stood in the frame, the new leader of the squad her son served under. At the bottom of the message, one sentence, "Mom, whatever you're doing, it's working." The head nurse entered with Brooke's badge. The suspension had been reversed. The board had voted unanimously, their apology already typed into the official record. Brooke clipped it to her collar, the real badge now, not the defaced one, and something in her shoulders shifted. Not quite relaxation. Captain Sullivan didn't relax. But a kind of settling. An alignment. She walked to the break room where 3 nurses sat, unable to meet her eyes. She poured coffee, the same machine, the same rotation, the same ritual, and sat at their table. The silence stretched long enough to measure. Finally, she spoke. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. "You give what you can now." One by one, they met her gaze. And she saw it beginning, the understanding that they'd been looking at a stranger the whole time. That the quiet woman refilling her coffee had been more than she appeared. That in a hospital full of people trained to save lives, sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who's already sacrificed everything and has nothing left to lose. Outside the break room, her tactical jacket hung on her locker, the faded unit patch, the patch she'd kept hidden for 9 months, now visible against the desert tan fabric. The symbol of a team she'd been separated from. The proof of a life she'd set aside. The reason she'd endured. The morning shift began under her command. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and proven everyone wrong, subscribe for more stories of hidden strength and quiet warriors. Like this video. And tell me in the comments, if someone like Brooke worked at your hospital, would you see her? Or would you see only what the person next to you told you to see? The answer says more about us than it does about her.